Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Soane Lecture Series. I am Michael Diaz-Griffith, Executive Director of the Soane Foundation, and on behalf of our Board of Trustees and our Chairman, Paul Whalen, I must say that we are delighted to see such a large and enthusiastic audience for today's talk. Before we begin, a quick note, which many of you will be familiar with. There will be a Q&A after today's discussion. So as the talk unfolds, please feel free to add questions to the Q&A box below in the toolbar on your screen. We will address as many questions as we can towards the end of the program. Now, this is the first in our 2021-2022 lecture series, Rule and Invention, for which we've invited thinkers from the fields of architecture, art, design, to explore the productive tensions that arise between the disciplines we practice and play, the exciting possibilities that lie in knowing when to break free from established patterns and convention. Now, we'll think more about these themes as the season progresses. But today, we want to reserve time for our brilliant speakers, David Adjaye and Thelma Golden, frequent collaborators whose ongoing work will be the topic of today's discussion. As many of you know, Sir David Adjaye is a Ghanaian and British architect who has received international acclaim for his impact on the field. In 2000, he founded Adjaye Associates, which today operates globally with studios in Accra, London, and New York, and projects spanning the globe. Adjaye's most well-known commission, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., opened on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in 2016 and was named Cultural Event of the Year by the New York Times. Adjaye was announced the winner of the 2021 RIBA Royal Gold Medal, considered one of the highest honors in British architecture for significant contributions to the field internationally. Adjaye was also recognized as one of the 100 most influential people of the year by Time magazine, and he was the 2014 recipient, we are proud to say, of the Soane Honors. Thelma Golden is Director and Chief Curator of the Studio Museum in Harlem, here in New York City, the world's leading institution devoted to visual arts by artists of African descent. Golden began her career as a Studio Museum intern in 1987. In 1988, she joined the Whitney Museum of American Art, where she launched her influential curatorial practice. In 2000, Golden returned to the Studio Museum as Deputy Director for Exhibitions and Programs, working closely with Director Lowry Stokes Sims. She succeeded Dr. Sims as director in 2005. Under her leadership, the Studio Museum has gained increased renown as a global leader in the exhibition of contemporary art, a center for innovative education, and a cultural anchor in the Harlem community. Thelma, David, we are honored that you could join us today. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to you and the entire Sir John Soane Museum Foundation community for inviting David and I to be in conversation today. Hello, David.
Hi. Hi.
So I thought, as a place to begin, David, in considering this conversation about art, architecture, community, but very specifically about the ways in which we have been in this dialogue collaboration, representing two distinct and important communities of people, your office and our whole architectural team and the Studio Museum team in creating this space for our new building. And so before I ask you to talk a bit about this project and building, I thought I might just give our audience a bit of history about the Studio Museum, both in our physical form, but the ways in which our homes have represented the ways in which we as an institution have developed and grown since our founding in 1968. So if I might have the first slide, please. The Studio Museum in Harlem was founded in 1968 with the express purpose of presenting the work of artists of African descent. Next slide, please. our opening was sort of greeted by the media and the press as being an effort that was not only about art, but about the reinvention of community. Our founders, the core group pictured here, were a very diverse group of philanthropists, community activists, corporate leaders, members of the art community, and very specifically artists who imagined both towards the past of Harlem and its history as the home of the Harlem Renaissance, but also were projecting, I believe, into the future we are living in now when they created the Studio Museum here at 2033 Fifth Avenue, which is a half block north of 125th Street, in a second floor loft space. Next slide, please. This original space was modest and in many ways I feel held all the aspiration of our founders by naming it the Studio Museum, right? This space over, as one can see, a liquor store, but very much with all of the intention that continues to guide our work, an institution bound around artists and their work, hence the studio in our name, a museum. Right? At a time when museums around New York City and the country were being challenged around their exclusion of Black artists, and as the Studio Museum in Harlem, citing us so specifically in our geography. Next slide, please. The museum then in 1979 acquired a building on 125th Street between Lenox and 7th, what was known then as the Kenwood Office Building. This building was very beautifully and brilliantly renovated for the museum by the architect J. Max Bond, a prime example of adaptive reuse in Harlem at that time, which had a lot of real estate stock that was sitting empty or underused. So that this became our home. We moved in 1981. Next slide, please. This building, which was a typical office building built in 1914, gave us these kind of incredible floor plates that were 10,000 square feet, really 200 feet deep building going from 125th Street to 124th Street. And in this space, we began to present our exhibitions, engage deeply in education for K through 12 students, but also lifelong learners, deeply reimagined what community engagement could be, and created a home for our collection. Next image, please. This, of course, was the space pretty much at opening. Max's sort of taking of what had been the bank's main business area, the main banking area, and turned it into this multi-level gallery with a mezzanine and a main floor, using temporary walls that engage the structural columns to create spaces where the institution then went on to make exhibitions which truly changed art history. Next slide, please. And this moving into the moment that I've had the pleasure of being at the Studio Museum, first as chief curator and now as its director, to continue this tradition of exhibition making in those spaces, but with the ambition and aspiration towards our future. Next image, please. So here, David, I'll stop and allow you now to reflect on what has been this sort of moment of thinking and imagining that created what we are looking at here, and that is the future home, the third home for the Studio Museum. You're on mute, David.
I'll do that. Thank you, Thelma. Sorry, typical technology challenges. Thank you for that. It's always great to hear about the history, the inspirational history of the Studio Museum. I always love the way it's really, we're so lucky to see, as it were, as sort of a guerrilla institution operating at large in the urban environment. And, you know, and here we are in the 21st century, now conceptualizing that it might become, not might become, will become one of the important institutions of the 21st century in defining how museums are evolved and what they do. So what was so profoundly interesting, considering we were discussing this earlier, that, you know, 9 years ago was when we started thinking about this in this project in some form. Not until 2017, that it really actually starts, you know, and obviously the rest we know in history. But in a way, what was striking to me is that a few things. One, that this idea that you described, the Studio Museum in Harlem, was just a profound kind of collection of words that really sums up the heart of what my inquiry is in my work, which is to uncover from the work not just my own authorial sort of idiosyncrasies, but to use the analysis of place, content, and ambition as a driver to then test my authorial instincts in shaping a form that is something that becomes of itself a reflection of those things, and something which produces something at the same time new that then looks into the future. So the summary, it really, and I could say it is that the summary of this whole project is exactly what you've explained, in the sense that this idea of the sort of loft space above the shop, this kind of wonderful sort of large stand space, and the windows that give this incredible light that artists so love, but also the idea of the sort of residential architecture of Harlem and how important it was for many artists who were using these buildings as their backdrop. The idea in Harlem that really Harlem has a very beautiful urban grain, because it really sort of permeates the street wall as a device, and then uses the window wall proportion of smaller windows above, larger windows below for shops, etc. Really articulating a sort of 19th and 20th century idea of how to make the city as a profound grain, and usually mostly 2 or no more than 3 materials everywhere until the late 20th century. And I think that there was something just really profoundly encouraging for me in that. This idea that actually in this notion of this very simple articulation of the street wall, there's this discourse about framing. Framing the edicular system, which is either to do with the lintels of the windows or the side panels of the windows, the sills, or just, if you really know the streets above 125th and below, just below going up to 120th, this idea of a kind of very pronounced sort of framing around all the apertures. Whenever there's an articulate aperture, there's a framing. And, my work, I always talk about that the way in which culture can be made from the fragments and memories of places, and that the greatest I think tests are usually about how those fragments can be scaled through the imagination of an author and an institution to imagine a new possibility, which for me kind of has a kind of powerful sense, in the sense that it creates a connection to a sort of body of knowledge that's not necessarily literal sometimes, but is embodied in the kind of the sort of energy of a group, and then trajects it into the future as a new phenomena, which allows future generations to see it and use it as they sort of wish to use it as. And so that's really talking about the way in which the outside is articulated, using to describe the idea of what the Studio Museum, studios, museum spaces, ground floors that are completely connected to the street and about an exchange and a kind of a relationship, a rapport. Art that is used to articulate the building's facade, to be signifiers, not just signs, but also be signifiers all the way through. And then inside, I literally wanted to learn exactly what, Max Bond, great Max Bond had sort of done. I think what he'd done with the limited sort of space that he had in demonstrating a kind of an extraordinary adaptive reuse strategy was to give you a sort of an arsenal of the kinds of spaces that almost, predicting what most artists of the 20th century would do, scale, width, narrow galleys, sort of beautiful, sort of edicular sort of moments were all articulated in his, in the original Studio Museum. And I was so inspired by that, and felt that, remember when we were talking, that we needed to, as it were, unfold Max's idea into a suite of spaces that would then now, in a way, honor that language, but in a very sort of systemic way throughout the building. As it were, really sticking to this idea of the roots of the project of the Studio Museum and its evolution and its tests and trials being, the check system that we're using to then grow this new sort of institution. And, something that became a very important part of Max's sort of refurbishment and the land that you got next door, this idea of the sort of the outdoor events that were always happening in the summer, the great events. In the project, we take the full width of the site, but then we offer a site on the roof, which is almost the same dimension as the alley, slightly bigger, that sort of repeats that through route experience, which will now, I would imagine and hope, will be repeated on the rooftop. And in a way, now we are looking to the north, looking to the skyline of the north and to the south. So in a way, it is bookended by these two, a frame, working with the facade on the north, and then on the south, this broken pediment that is a brow that really talks about the top of the building, and this sort of skylight, which is this kind of half pyramid which draws light deep into the plan. So the building is really about these lessons. We can talk through it as we go into the details, but I think I've set the frame for what the agenda is in it.
Thank you, David. And I think what you have said, I think it's important to say a few things. One, as is clear, we made a decision, the Studio Museum in Harlem, our board, our team, to build literally on the site that we were, which essentially means we took down the Kenwood office building, the building that had been our building, to build this new structure. And in many ways, that allows us this kind of direct relationship, as you are saying, and as you have exhibited in this design, so much that you took from what Max's ambition was. And as we know, Max, unfortunately, is no longer with us. But I had the great privilege of knowing Max through my entire professional career, as a great friend of the Studio Museum, a longtime resident of Harlem. And at the early moments of my own thinking about what was possible in our building, Max was always so clear to me that he saw what he did as this invitation towards imagining more and a future, right? And so that the politics even, right? They were powerful, that the Studio Museum in Harlem, this small institution, completely unconventional in the way in which it created itself, but completely rooted in an idea of autonomy and the community. What it was, Max imagined that the building was a frame to contain it and allow it to grow. And what this design and what you have done and what this building will be very much sits literally, right, on the foundation that J. Max Baum created. But I also think, David, it would be interesting for you to talk, because I know that perhaps, in the brief for this building, you had an awareness of all of the needs, which were tied to mission, right? Everything about our brief was about how we continue to create a place that would present, preserve, and steward and engage the work of artists of African descent, from the 19th century, which is where our collection begins, into the present. And to do that in an institutional format that continues to privilege the idea that as an institution, we are engaged deeply with audience, right, as a primary relationship. So David, could you talk with these images now on the screen of our section, as well as some of the interior views, about how you responded to the brief, right, the formal brief, but also the brief that felt to me, the director, who's also a curator, was important as a way to open out some thinking about how this building would situate itself in Harlem, right? So that early in our conversations, I presented 3 experiences of Harlem that I thought were so critical to understanding this important iconic community. They were the experience of the street and street life, the experience of the stage, right? And in the important place the performing arts play within African-American culture, and the experience of the sanctuary, as that relates so deeply to an idea of how Harlem is bound around its relationship to the spiritual, and the spiritual through all aspects of life. So the street, the stage, and the sanctuary were these sort of three, we could understand them as physical spaces, but also ideas that felt deeply important. And would love for you now to talk as these images really show in detail the sense of the space that you created, how that is informed by your own sense of spaces for art and spaces for people, and how that is evident here.
No, absolutely. So in a way that the three statements, the three words that you've used are the sort of backbone of the sort of, as I say, the sort of overarching brief. And in a way, I sort of jumped into the detail a little bit early here in speaking about this. But I think that you can see from the images, the sort of quad set of images on the screen, that in the top left-hand corner really is the critical image of looking out towards 125th Street, and the idea that the foyer of the museum is a dissolve. It's something that is engaging with the street and allowing the life and the color and the light of the street to permeate deep into the furthest kind of reaches of the plan. And this is the furthest moment that you could get to in the building looking back. And it engages with this idea of a space that is really dissolving with the street and creating a sense of procession. In a way, there's this very large staircase that's 10 foot wide, that is really part of my sort of interpretation of winding the street up into the building and ascending up into the sort of upper levels. It's a vertical stack building. It's not a horizontal building because of the space that we have. So it inevitably rises up. But this idea of that dissolve of the street is really very much played through here. And then this idea of the stage, this idea of a place where one can project and one can kind of set up things, where informality can kind of be accommodated to create opportunities, as well as formal things. So in the next set of images, you'll see it, but you don't have to go to it yet. This idea of a sort of open theater. Instead of having a closed auditorium, we have an open theater which looks directly onto the street and plays a game with the street that references Harlem and the stoops of the kind of vernacular domestic architecture, but really also talks about this idea of the stage and the ability to be able to perform in this space. And then as you sort of go through it, what we tried to really do was to make sure that there were these moments, that the galleries are not just sort of the carved up leftovers, but they are specific conditions with different scales and atmospheres. And also even through the circulation spaces, designed as spaces of opportunity for display, so that the entire experience of moving through the building is moments of encounter to be able to see art. We loved, this way of thinking, because in a way it's analogous to, for me, my most favorite time with art is actually seeing it in an artist's studio and seeing that moment when an artist, clears their stuff and it's in their hall or it's in the room that they're making it in. And this idea of rooms or chambers with art became a very important idea in organizing the different qualities of spaces that one is going to see in the building when it's complete, including the sort of what I call the formal and informal transitional spaces, which are also calibrated to be able to allow artists to use them if they wish. So in a way, those three things, and in a way that is, for me, the sort of half vault, double height space is probably one of the kind of moments which really speaks directly to the notion of the sanctuary, the soaring space that's framed and has a specificity. And that is the kind of the largest gallery in the section of the building, and one that allows the scope of exhibit, but also the kind of profound way in which it can be kind of used as a sort of emphatic space to play out. So in a way, it's a collection of these qualities, not just sort of thrown together, but choreographed as a sequence of sort of open, connected spaces, intimate, closed spaces that allow you to kind of move between expanding and contracting and making relationships to large and small works, intimate works, or even digital works that you'll encounter in the museum. Let's look at the next image. And then this is really I love this from the reverse. So if we were looking in that sort of top left-hand corner from the very sort of rear of the museum, looking out to the street, this is looking from across 125th Street in that plaza that's in front of that sort of State Department building, and looking back at the institution. This new and at once, I hope, familiar form, but in a different articulation. You know, what was kind of amazing to be able to build this building. It's made out of a terrazzo precast system that sort of oscillates between matte and sheen, and recess, deep recess and shallow recess. So really, it's, you know, it's very hard to kind of model it, but it's basically always articulating itself with natural light, the sort of the orientation of east-west light and the north light that hits it, and artificial light and the way it sort of illuminates itself. This idea of the depth of the building is always being sort of articulated. So these frames of different conditions and depths are always being played through. So you're understanding the inhabitations, and that the building then sort of has a quality that we're able to achieve because it's a cultural building where we're able to oversail at the higher levels, oversail the street with form and mass in a way that, you know, the commercial buildings are not sort of capable of doing. And that allows us to have an articulation that differentiates this building very much in the commercial screen of buildings that are happening either side of the sort of incredible development that's happening on 125th. That even in the future, the building has a certain articulation that really will always show a distinct quality that is about cultural punctuations that are going to be happening on 125th. And that was something that, you know, the city was amazing to kind of discuss with the team at that time, and to be able to really get that through the system and to have this for this building. It's something I'm very excited about, because it's definitely not something you can do as a commercial building, and it's going to be something that's, I think, a gift to the street.
Well, it's will be so distinct now and in the future on 125th Street. And that's what we certainly appreciated about your design and the collective work of your team, Adjaye Associates and Cooper Robertson together, which really worked on this program to, on the one hand, take in the challenge that we were working in this defined lot, but then to maximize on every level what we could do internally and externally. And I also have to say, you know, my prime example, David, of thinking of the way in which the collaboration, right, and the conversation around this building developed is that after giving you that street stage and sanctuary, you added the stoop. Right? You brought in another experience, one that you discussed as being this interchange between the public and the private space, right? In Harlem, the going in and out of buildings. And so really the design is a manifestation in so many ways of those ideas, but also is so closely related to the practical necessity of the institution, both in its current form. You know, this project was in design development as we celebrated our 50th anniversary. And for an institution like the Studio Museum, that 50th anniversary was such an important milestone, right? Because it allowed us to understand this trajectory from the late 60s, right? A museum like ours born in a moment like the one we're in now. It comes out of all the politics and the possibility of an institution that really, as I say, its founders deeply, deeply, deeply thought into the future as they lived in their present. But also what's so interesting and amazing is the fact that in the time that we have been in this process, the changes on 125th Street that have long been predicted have come to be. Right? So you were thinking not only of situating this building into the 125th Street of the present, but also looking at the way it was changing and shifting and what form, architectural form, could we create that would live in a way that is as iconic, for example, as our neighbor 1 block west of us, the Apollo Theater, right? Which has sat in that spot for almost 100 years. Yeah. Looking and living in that way and indicating to all its presence and its history. David, can you talk a bit before we show the animation of your work specifically with artists? Because, another reason why I think, our work with you has been so resonant is because in many ways your work with artists showed us a way to think about how to create a space that's about the presentation of artwork, but also the making of artwork. The making of artwork by our artists in residence in their studios, but also the engaging in making by young people and elders in our community in all of our programs. And that idea of the studio in our name being a way to understand a very important part of our mission, right? It being a studio, quite literally. I'm wondering if you could talk about, again, what you are so known for, and that is significant influential work with contemporary artists.
No, it's interesting because my career really started with artists in the sense that they were my first patrons. I didn't get work from the sort of industry. It was really the art world that really recognized what I was interested in, and it was artists my generation at that time, many years ago, who were finding their ways themselves in the world, who brought me into institutions to collaborate with them, and brought me to their homes to help them configure, their domestic homes and their studios. So in a way, my early baptism of my architectural thinking was really very much informed by, I think, a very powerful sort of group, what artists are, in terms of the kind of the clarity of thinking about the ideas. One thing that I've always, really always speak of very clearly is the insistence that for me, working with artists who I think are some of the toughest clients that you could ever have, in the sense that they are very clear about what they like and don't like. And your rigor in having to, be convincing to them about what you need to do was a great discipline. So, and I to this day still do that. I'm to this day collaborating with artists, and to the point now where we're working on very large projects. For instance, we're working on a sort of national cathedral in Ghana, where we're working with 40 artists now, where we're looking at not just masters but also younger generation artists who are working all over the building. So in a way, the sort of thesis of the beginning is absolutely still finding its way. It's not just about collaborating, but also working very directly with the process of art in creating works of architecture.
Thank you. Michael, if we could now show the animation, which I hope our peers with us will appreciate seeing the building in its full form. Great. It's always so exciting to see that, David, to see what will be the manifestation, of this building. And I'm wondering now if we could just expand the aperture out a bit. And I would love for you to talk just a bit about museums, right? And what you see as their potential. Through your practice, you have made many different kinds of museum buildings, from the Nobel Peace Prize Museum to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and so many other museum forms in between. And certainly to work with you is to be engaged in a kind of thinking about museums in what they can be. So can you talk a bit about this form and format and your thoughts about it in relation to not simply this project, the Studio Museum project, but perhaps other projects that you've worked on or are working on in this moment?
Wow, I was telling that that's a thesis and could occupy its own sort of talk. I mean, I have been lucky enough to be throughout my practice, really being engaged deeply with this notion of what is the museum and what is the museum in the 21st century. As you said, right from the first museum project we did, the Nobel Peace Center, right through to what we're now doing now, which is the sort of Edo Museum of West African Art in Nigeria. So we've gone full circle from moving from looking at 20th century produce, which is film, digital, archive, stories, through to thinking about the restitution of artifacts and what does that mean within the host countries that lost that restitution, and also in the kind of the sort of debate about what the contemporary museum is now in the world, especially in the global north, as it were, and what is it teaching? What are the issues? I think that there are so many conversations now happening that are really profoundly shifting some of the perceptions about the museum, and I think it's a fantastic and fundamental kind of moment to really, if one is building sort of a museum right now, I think fundamental questions are faced. You are faced with fundamental questions about why, what, and what and who's it for, and the assumptions that we've had about collections and spaces are all up for grabs in terms of dialogue and discussion. But fundamentally, the museum is, for me, an incredible edifying space for community, and that ability for it to be an important sort of resource in the art of city making, I think is still incredibly relevant, even in the digital world that we live in. We know more and more as we increase and get deeper into the digital world, the power of the real experience, the power of the artifact, and the power of storytelling through artifacts and works, and the sort of what philosophers talk about, the sort of the other intelligence. I think the complementary intelligence to the sciences, which are really about the way in which we engage with the creativity of our, of humankind, and how it produces that knowledge. So for me, it's as profound as that. It is a kind of knowledge-making sort of arena. It is a space of the social and the collective, and it is as relevant now as even though it's mode and sometimes the thesis of what these things are. I think that it's interesting that the words that have been behind why museums were made are now sometimes, the words are sometimes, in some cases completely now not clear, but that the museums in themselves fall into new categories and new ideas about our collective understanding of cities and city life and objects and artifacts and histories that really, I think, sort of go past and sometimes supersede some of the agendas that are set out by institutions. So it's a hugely complicated, I've skirted around a lot of things, as you can hear, but it's a hugely complicated issue, but I think it's an exciting one for anybody involved in making museums right now.
Right. And thinking about museums and
Completely.
really, imagining them, right, both in their built form, but also in the space that they hold in our culture at this moment. That's perhaps what's most exciting about building this. We've talked often about, that this project is very much about bricks and mortar, but it's also going back to our founding moment about an imagining of a kind of cultural space, a social space, even spiritual space. If we think about the role and the idea of art and the way in which art can exist, and where artists sort of live within our culture, right? As seers, as visionaries, as thinkers, and interlocutors. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
I'd love now to ask Michael if he might, I know he's been moderating the questions in the chat, and if he might allow us to move to a Q&A.
That would be lovely, Thelma. And on behalf of the audience, which I know is enjoying this very much, just thank you to you and David for the conversation so far. It's been riveting and the building is gorgeous.
Thank you.
I'm seeing three focuses among the Q&A questions, and thank you everyone for posing these questions. I think the umbrella is going to be community engagement. So let's just flag that for a moment, as I mentioned two other areas that will relate back to community engagement. Amina asks how accessibility is articulated in the building's narrative to make it an inclusive space for people with disabilities, for the community that the museum is being built with and for. And in a slightly different register, Alonso's asking if you could expand on how the new building's design relates to the intended display of works, and beyond that, to the work of artists, and in particular, possible artists in residence. So there's sort of several different angles on community engagement here.
Sure. Maybe, David, would you like to take the first one about the design in relation to accessibility? And then perhaps we can take the one about the design in relation to artists and display of work.
Sure. So the building is completely accessible to all bodies. It is designed in a way to use, because it's a vertically sort of aligned building, it's designed to always create parallel experiences between either using the elevator or the staircase, so that there's never a sort of sense that one is being made more prescient than the other. So they always arrive more or less in the same places for anybody using the building, and that every single floor is completely accessible for everybody from wheelchair to any other sort of mobility disability and visual disability and acoustic and sort of hearing disability that people will have. So the building is as fully accessible as we understand that term to be, and that has been a very important and sensitive part of how we make this building.
Thank you, David. And in terms of presentation, yes, as a museum that began collecting early in its institutional life. So, it's important to say that as an institutional type, we were not started with a collection. This museum did not come to be because there was a collection of work, but it came to be to collect so that there would be a collection of work of artists by African descent. So we definitely thought about what it meant to display, quite literally, the work that's in our collection, which begins in the 19th century of a type and scale and moves into the present. And at a part of our collection, of course, includes the work of artists in residence. So in many ways, we thought of the spaces as they relate to the idea of works that are made in the building that would then come into our collection and be shown there. And with that, have opened the possibility of some site specificity around some of those works. As artists, one of the wonderful things about the Artists in Residence program is the adjacency between the galleries and the studios, both in our former building, but in the design, so that that relationship to the galleries for the artists is real. So thinking about the work that we might acquire and have in the collection, often it can be with a sense of site specificity. So all of that was thought of in the design. And this is where, again, this project is the complete result of some amazing teams of people right? In these various organizations, Adjaye Associates, Cooper Robertson, the Studio Museum in Harlem, coming together in many different ways to kind of think through all of those possibilities.
Brilliant. And Stephen asks, sort of building on the question of community engagement, how the community was engaged in the design process, and what, if any, design control was surrendered or compromised to include their input. A very timely question in 2021.
Yeah, no, completely. And, as an institution that has been long rooted in the community, we certainly had a process thinking about the building and its uses. So design being one part of that, but even just moving back from design to sort of think about what it meant, as I said, to have had a building, had a space that was the community identified with in so many ways, and what it meant to be creating a new one. So we did have a process that engaged a deep amount of conversation around what this building could be. And then presented, as we were at the different phases of design, presented the designs to various different kinds of stakeholder groups, formal and informal, along the way.
Thelma, just shifting a bit for both you and David, there are several questions over and above all of the compliments about the beauty of the staircase and the stoop, about the museum storage areas, archival spaces, sort of specifics about what these new spaces will allow you to do that maybe you haven't been able to do before, both with the community, but also on the level of conservation and all of that good stuff.
Yes, well, look, that's the most exciting question. Perhaps, one aspect of this building that I am excited about beyond measure is the fact for the first time in the Studio Museum in Harlem's history, we will have a loading dock. And what that means is that anyone who's ever been to the Studio Museum in Harlem, who's seen an exhibition in our spaces, our first building at 2033, 144, all of that artwork came in through the front door or the back door off the street. Like, we have never had a drive-in loading dock. So what that's going to mean for what it just means for us to do what we do is incredibly exciting. And it's a beautiful space. And I am, cannot wait for it to be in action. Our collection is stored in a separate facility, as is our archive. So this building the brief did not include art storage and archive. What it does include, however, for the first time, is a group of spaces that allow us to engage in care and conservation of our work in dedicated spaces. But even beyond that, writ large, what I have to say, and I still have a deep amount of nostalgia for our former building, because it was a building that was a shapeshifter, right? Most of the spaces in the building were used for many, many, many different things. So the galleries where exhibitions were presented were also where we did our workshops with young people. It's also where we had public programs. It's also where perhaps we had different other kinds of events. And now in this building, there are separate spaces for all of these activities. There's an incredible suite of workshop rooms for our education programs. There's a separate space for our teen programs, the studios that exist within their own zone. There is a welcome center, a cafe, a store, as I said, preparation rooms for art, for the care and consideration to artwork as it's moving in and out of the building. And then there are also spaces for the community just to engage. The stoop lives as what is essentially a public space, one that will exist outside of the ticketed zone of our institution, that will allow people to come off 125th Street for a moment of respite in this incredible, beautiful building.
Wonderful. I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So David, I'm going to ask you a Soanean question before we lose you. And then Thelma, we want to ask you about the future of the museum and its expansion in ways beyond the building. But first, David, we have several devoted Soaneans asking you about your interactions with the Soane Museum, I think in part because your description of the Studio Museum was so poetic, and we all know how deeply you work with art and with artists, And the Soane Museum, which we all love, is of course so much about both the art inside the collection and the vessel that carries the collection. And they're interrelated in all of these interesting ways. So I think that Soanians are craving just a comment on what your experience of the museum has been.
I think that, there's not a single architecture student who has studied in London who is not at some point baptized by the incredible sort of power of the Soane Museum, and I think, everything from the way in which it articulates itself in a residential street to have a certain kind of iconography that really speaks to a specific condition, right through to, working within a limited geometry, the ability to carve extraordinary spaces and a sense of unfolding, which I really love, and a sense of, endless space in something which is incredibly limited, and the beautiful way in which the very precious light of London is filtered magically to illuminate, the incredible casts and objects that are in this incredible treasure trove. A sort of mini wonder card, it's a wonder box, and it's obviously a testament to the sort of hunger and the passion of Soane to reach and to understand, having an understanding about the world. He wanted to understand every part of the world, and he wanted to put it in a fitting setting to sort of inspire him and this context. So, I've been in the building so many times, and I've enjoyed and enjoy, every time that I've sort of spent in there. So it's just part of the language of understanding, I think, a sort of North European sort of sensibility towards how one kind of works with light and carving space and creates relationships and enfilades and folds in space that kind of deal with, essentially predominantly objects and some visual works. We love it.
Love it. We love it. And there's so much more that could be discussed, including in the context of your projects in West Africa, a museum of discovery versus a museum of return. Thelma, before we leave, Kevin asks how the Studio Museum Harlem and Adjaye Associates are planning for the future of the museum in this sense. The Metropolitan Museum of Art at 150, MoMA nearing 100 years are examples of constant growth and expansion. And we can't imagine that the Studio Museum would be anything different. So we're hearing about community, but in terms of your sort of strategic goals for the institution, what can you share with us? And I'll feed in a question that I'm seeing elsewhere, which is just, how has the political and sociocultural climate of the last 2 years influenced and affected this project as it unfolds in real time?
Yeah, thank you. Both incredibly important questions. And in our remaining 2 minutes, what I'll say is the last 2 years reaffirmed what our founders understood, and that is the importance of Black space, the importance of what it means to build community, physically build, but also to invest in what it means to create this space. So to imagine what's being asked of our museum world, for example, in these last 2 years, is very much why the Studio Museum was founded. Right, to model an ideal of equity, and one that has self-determination sort of built into this idea of creating a space that lives within its role to present, preserve, and to steward. I think in terms of a future, this physical expansion very much, I think, honors the 50-some years of work that were made possible by the directors before me. I feel somewhat just a steward of this incredible trajectory. Right? These were seeds that were planted from the day we were founded and through each successive director after me. And so my hope is that the seeds that are being planted now, not just with this building in its manifestation and opening, but in the places in which we are building in our program, building in our ability to continue to serve, this incredible mission right, to present and preserve the work of artists of African descent locally, nationally, and internationally, and to do so in ways that amplify the beauty and the power and the possibility of Black culture will continue.
What a beautiful conclusion to this discussion and a beginning for your institution, Thelma, and for a gorgeous building that we are all very excited to visit in person.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone who's here with us. I know David and I, this opportunity to talk about, the building is always one that I think helps me learn more about it and understand in very deep and profound ways the work that we are doing, but also appreciate all of those who joined us today to think with us and to listen and to be a part of this moment.
Absolutely. David, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to my team and to Cooper Roberts, who are an incredible partner in helping us deliver this very important project.
And to both of you, please know that you are welcome back anytime to discuss the building, other work, your mission at the Studio Museum, and we simply cannot wait to be there with you both.
But we'll invite you all when the building is finished to come physically and be on site with us. That's what we hope. We'll have a chance then.
That is the best of all possible worlds, in-person events.
Exactly.
And thank you to everyone for tuning in today. Our next talk will be on November 15th with Barry Bergdahl, and you will hear much more about it by email and on Instagram. Thank you again, and have a good evening.